It's 10 o'clock. Good morning. I'm going to launch this 18th Ditch Diggers Dialogue and get us going on time. I want to welcome all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Deborah Harvey, the Executive Director of the Heavy Construction Contractors Association. I also want to introduce Ashley Hudson, our Operations Manager, who will be assisting in running the presentation today on behalf of John Drake. If this is your first time tuning into a Ditch Diggers Dialogue, welcome. HCCA strives to provide educational and networking opportunities for our membership. So we created Ditch Diggers Dialogue series as a virtual way to stay connected. Disconnects in the global and national supply chain are affecting every facet of daily life, from grocery shopping to equipment manufacturing. The construction industry has been particularly impacted by cost delays and deliveries of materials. Many are wondering, how did this occur and when can we expect improvement? This concern will be addressed today as we are joined by the Vice President of Supply Chain Policy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, John Drake. In his position, John oversees the development and implementation of the Chamber's supply chain policy priorities and represents the Chamber before Congress, the administration, the business community, and other stakeholders. While we had hoped to host John at our January dinner meeting, unfortunately, COVID intervened and we had to reschedule. We are very excited to be joined virtually and hope that HCCA members gain insight into the supply chain intricacies through this presentation. During today's session, we ask that you keep your microphone muted until we open the floor for questions. If you have questions or thoughts as we move through the presentation, I encourage you to type them into the chat box so they can be addressed at the end. Now I'm going to turn it over to John, and thank you for being here with us today. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for the opportunity to speak before your membership. And yeah, I was just as disappointed that we couldn't do this in person, but unfortunately, I think COVID had other plans. But I have a feeling that future opportunities in person may be before us before we know it. So thank you again, and let me just start by saying, you know, what I want to do with this presentation is, first of all, not PowerPoint you to death, but hopefully this will be a good, this presentation will be a good way to sort of organize the narrative that the business community is pulling together as to the causes for this great supply chain disruption and what we're seeing for this year in terms of outlook. So Ashley, if you may. So look very quickly how we got here. You know, I think a lot of businesses were, you know, taken aback by the surge in COVID. You know, we'll see that it led to an enormous drop in consumer demand very, very quickly. But because of fiscal stimulus by Congress and the administration, that helped fuel an enormous surge in consumer demand pretty soon after that drop. This also followed enormous shifts in how consumers were spending their hard-earned dollars, and those shifts in demand led to larger disruptions across the supply chain, across the business community. Next slide, please. So this table here, I think, illustrates something that I think is very dramatic in that you see around April of 2020, there was an enormous drop in consumer demand that consequently followed a huge uptick in consumer spending, all within just a few days of one another, seemingly. This drop is important for a number of reasons. One, because of that drop, a lot of businesses made decisions around hiring, around labor, around orders that they believed at the time was part of what was going to be a longer decline in consumer demand. For many of them, they believed that there wasn't going to be Americans out buying new cars, going on vacations, buying new retail goods and the like. And so as a result of that, they made decisions around that. However, pretty soon after this drop, Congress and then President Trump stepped in with the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which injected approximately $1.9 trillion into the economy. Next slide, please. So what you see with this slide here is, right around this time was a huge increase in consumer spending. This retail slide is intended to kind of be illustrative of not just a return to normal, but how consumer spending actually skyrocketed well above normal. And the yellow dotted line is intended to kind of show what the historical increase was expected to be. And the blue line is the reality. And with that blue line, you can see that U.S. consumers were spending more than they ever were before. And part of this was because of the fiscal stimulus that was in the system. Another part of it, and I think this is just as important, is that because of quarantine orders and COVID, U.S. consumers dramatically shifted how they were dedicating their U.S. dollars. So before, you might be going out to restaurants, you might be going to shows. My wife, for example, she had a trip to New York because she loves to see Broadway shows. All that was postponed, right? And so as a result, Americans who had discretionary spending, they diverted that money away from what they could not do, i.e. going out and enjoying themselves, and instead to what they could do. In a lot of cases, that was going online, going to Amazon, going to Target.com, what have you, and buying retail goods. Next slide, please. So taken all together, what resulted is that you had, right around April, with the drop in consumer demand, you had many businesses cut orders that led to shortages of key inputs when demand returned, right? So the auto industry, great example. They believed that Americans weren't going to be buying cars, and so what they did is they went to their semiconductor providers, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, Samsung, what have you, and said, look, we're not going to be ordering from you this year because we don't think Americans are going to be out buying new cars. And so those companies went out and they shifted their production to serve different customers, the Microsofts and the Dells and personal computing and the like. Also happening around this time is that COVID forced factory closures all across Asia. And with those closures meant that goods weren't coming here to the United States. But when those factories came back online, suddenly there was a huge surge in goods traveling to the United States to our West Coast ports that put a lot of pressure to move those goods and frankly overwhelm those ports to move those goods in a productive manner. Another example, with the drop in demand, there was a lot of companies that would essentially cancel contracts with a lot of their trucking companies, saying, we don't think the demand's going to be there. And so in 2020, you saw 3 times the normal amount of trucking companies go out of business as what happens in any given year. And the trucking industry, as you all know, there was already a truck driver shortage there prior to COVID, and this this event only exacerbated that shortage, so that today we've got over 80,000 driver shortage that is going to be really difficult to replace. Taking a step back, the U.S. workforce remains 4 million workers below what it was pre-pandemic. So there is, frankly, there is just labor struggles all across the board. And then the last point is that you had approximately, with this enormous shift in consumer spending and the consumer spending habits, you had approximately 5 to 7 years of e-commerce growth happen all within a single year. And when you take into account the driver shortages, the surge in goods that were coming to the ports, it created enormous stress all across the transportation logistics sector, and a huge increase in transportation costs. And this all taken together is a big reason for why there were a lot of businesses complaining about shortages. You saw a lot of news around doing your Christmas shopping early. It's because the ability to secure goods and products came under stress in a way last year that I don't think it really, frankly, ever has in quite some time. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about LA and Long Beach, and why are we talking about this? So LA and Long Beach are arguably the two most important ports to the United States. And the reason for that is because 40% of all imports, seaborne imports, travel through these two ports. There's no other port that has the amount of traffic coming through these two ports as LA and Long Beach. Next slide, please. And at some point last year, there was over 100 ships waiting to enter into these two ports. And there was over 100 ships simply because the amount of goods that were traveling into these two ports was such that it was overwhelming the ability of the port workers, the truckers, the railroads, everybody, the port terminals, to process it quickly enough. You had a huge pileup of containers that were happening at ports. You had reports of both ports that frankly didn't have the real estate to store all the containers that are coming in. As a result of that, you had ships that were sitting longer at dock waiting to be unloaded because there frankly wasn't the space to move the containers coming in. At one point, LA and Long Beach actually reported that they were at 110% capacity with their warehousing capacity. What that meant was there was so many containers that were sitting at port that there was no longer the room for trucks to come in and actually move those containers that were sitting to where they needed to go. So that the very fact of the amount of containers coming in became its own problem. Next slide, please. And you can kind of see this also in the annual container statistics. This is approximately a 20% increase in container volume coming in compared to any other year. Unheard of. When you take into account all the other challenges that the logistics and transportation industry was facing with workers being out due to business closures or COVID positives, it's frankly really encouraging the productivity that I think a lot of our workers and our businesses were able to do to just process the sheer amount of stuff that was coming in. But I think a lot of the public took away that it was still overwhelming for everybody involved. Next slide, please. So what we have seen in the last few weeks, there are some signs that things are getting better than where they were. We have seen that the ocean rate, carrier rate has declined since its peak in September. Spot pricing from Shanghai to LA is down about 20%. I think it's a little bit lower now. But I think it's fair to say that, we're better than where we were, but things are still extremely challenging, I think, for everyone involved. Next slide, please. We are, so the amount of traffic that's waiting off the West Coast ports continues to be high. We're also hearing increasing reports that the challenges that LA and Long Beach have extended to other ports as well. We're hearing that there is slowdowns of traffic moving through Seattle, Tacoma, Georgia's Port of Savannah, New York, New Jersey, all up and down, not just the West Coast, but also the East Coast as well. There is also, blockages. China and other countries are issuing zero tolerance policies in regards to COVID and Omicron, which is creating ripple effects across the supply chain. So, China has already shut down Tianjin, Shenzhen, and Beijing, which are all three of them are important centers of production. But each time you have one of these shutdowns, it means that you're going to have a stop in the flow of goods coming from these countries, from these cities rather. And when that lockdown is lifted, you're going to have that surge in traffic that's coming. One of the challenges that the West Coast ports faced last year. So that challenge is still in place. Businesses are increasingly hoarding out of concern for future volatility of key supplies. And what we're seeing is that results in its own shortages in other industries as it becomes difficult for businesses to secure the goods that they need to produce the materials and the products that they're making for their customers. So you see these reverberations that are happening across the board that are difficult to track, but are still being impacted by everybody. We expect that there's going to be challenges this year as the longshoremen, who are the unionized workforce for the West Coast ports, their labor contract is set to expire July 1 of this year. In a couple weeks, we expect that they're going to sit down with the port terminals and begin work on negotiating a new contract. Historically, these labor negotiations are frankly tough. And there has been, for example, in 2002, President Bush had to issue the Taft Act to intervene. Then President Obama had to personally step in 2015 to bring a new labor contract to close. And quite frankly, you've got the longshoremen who are coming into this round knowing that they've got to leverage because the ports don't want to see any service disruptions happen whatsoever. So expect that's going to be difficult. So, and again, there's going to be aftershocks of other disruptions that I think is difficult to track, but folks should be mindful that will happen. How the business community begins to get semiconductors again, and where there are shortages, what that means for other products that are being produced as well, downstream. Next slide, please. And, I think it's also important to talk about how U.S. ports are increasingly under the microscope. We're relying upon ports to move a lot of goods coming in. And despite the conversation about how important the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach are, you really can't walk away from that conversation without talking about how they do worldwide in terms of productivity. Productivity being a measurement of how quickly these ports are able to move containers, offload, from the ship, send it on their way, or load onto the ship itself. Out of a ranking of 351 ports worldwide, LA ranks 328th in the world, and Port of Long Beach ranks 333rd in the world. Quite frankly, the U.S. it's getting its butt kicked when it comes to how modern our ports are. Our best ranked port is the Port of Philadelphia at number 83. And you can see here just the top 5 ports worldwide are in the Middle East and Asia. So we really need to look at ways to modernize our ports so that we can move the goods as they're coming in. Otherwise, it's only going to be a drag on our economy. Next slide, please. Another thing that is increasingly being an issue that we're facing is how geopolitics is increasingly driving policy decision-making here in Washington, D.C. One of the first things that President Biden did upon taking office was issue an executive order, America's Supply Chain, which ordered the administration to take a top-to-bottom look at the supply chain resiliency of a number of key critical sectors. There's been increasing efforts under the U.S. Innovation Competition Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, that micromanages supply chain transactions, puts new restrictions on where the U.S. government, for example, can secure its goods, increasingly prohibiting products coming from China, for example, looking at increasing the domestic production of semiconductors is another example. And the U.S. is not alone in this. And so what that means is increasingly you're going to see governments playing a much more active role in the decision-making of supply chain providers worldwide, and increasing scrutiny over other aspects of supply chains as well. So manufacturing, mining, ICT, et cetera, which is all going to lead to higher uncertainty and higher costs across the board. Next slide, please. And these policies are only feeding into increasing C-suite discussion, around shifting supply chains in the face of what we've just come out of. For a lot of businesses, China is no longer the the reliable partner that they were several years ago. Businesses are increasingly looking at regionalization, nearshoring, and reshoring as potential solutions to make sure that they don't see disruptions, and they don't see the sorts of problems that they're increasingly seeing with policymakers' actions about how we're treating China. Good example on the nearshoring side is United Colors of Benetton. They made a decision late last year that they were going to move production out of China, 50% of their production out of China, and move it closer to the marketplace in Europe. So in the last few months, they have moved production out of China, and they've moved it to Turkey, Egypt, Croatia, and other countries so that it can better serve their European marketplace. But I think the important thing here is just the cost, all that involved. Up to $1 trillion over 5 years to move production out of China for what's being discussed. Next slide, please. So I think, bottom line for us, we're going to see increasing uncertainty across the board in 2022. Businesses are slowly going to be returning to some semblance of normal, quote unquote. But I think bottom line, it's important to say that the normal that I think we all experienced as of 3, 4, 5 years ago is frankly over. And the business community should expect that there's going to be increasing disruption and changes in supply chains across the board moving forward. And, those decisions are still going to take some time to play themselves out. But there should continue to be an expectation that businesses are going to have to be resilient in the face of these challenges. So with that, I will turn it over to questions. And thank you for your patience sitting through that.
John, I'm going to start the ball rolling with a question that came up at our vendor showcase last week. And we were talking specifically about supply chain disruptions and how that particular vendor was dealing with not being able to provide his goods to the construction community. And his comment was he didn't have as much problem with actually obtaining the goods as with keeping an inventory, because when the business or the construction community became aware that he actually had goods to sell, they would descend like locusts and wipe him out completely. And he could not refill his inventory as quickly as he would like because of that hoarding type behavior. Do you see this across other industries? And do you have any thoughts as to how that might be addressed both on a business level and on a government policy level?
Yeah, we are seeing it. A good example, we heard from so we have one of our members is an OEM, and they told us that they had to last year they had to shut down a production line at a cost of $20 million per week, and that decision was made based on the fact that they were lacking in approximately $500,000 worth of inventory. So for them, that's an inexcusable. For them, that's simply inexcusable. And so their decision going forward is they're going to make sure that they have the product that they need on hand to ensure that that never happens again. So this just-in-time sort of delivery process, I think, is largely done certainly for the time being. I think we are hearing of members who are either seeing hoarding that's preventing them from accessing the supplies that they need to keep their production lines going. And I think it's going to take some time for this to play out. I think, as supply becomes a little bit more, normalized, is the best way to describe it. We expect that businesses are going to continue doing everything they can to make sure that they don't see a production stoppage like this OEM member that I just referenced.
Thank you for that. Glenn, you're muted. Glenn, you're muted.
Thought I hit it. Sorry, John. I'm always interested in the micro and macro aspects of our economy in the world here. With the shipping ports throughout America, is a part of our inefficiency simply because in the last 100 years or so, we've gone from a, export to an import economy? Is it the dynamics of the way the ports were designed to begin with? And then does it have anything to do with just simply the lack of investment? What exactly has led to the inefficiencies of our port system? It's not like this has happened overnight.
Yeah. No, I think it has to do with a few things. First of all, I don't think it's necessarily because our economy has shifted from an export economy to an import economy. I think the biggest driving factors is the fact that a lot of our ports, frankly, have not kept pace with the innovations that other ports around the world have adopted. So automation, more productive cranes and the like. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of this is because the labor agreements that have historically been agreed to between the terminals and the labor have not allowed for these types of innovations to occur. In 2007, the longshoremen accepted a concession to allow for automation to take place, and the terminals didn't. I didn't think they did not take advantage of that concession. But we know that going into this round of negotiation, the longshoremen view automation as an existential threat to their livelihood. So they're going to fight like cats and dogs to make sure that that's taken out. So I think part of it is, the terminals themselves haven't made the investments and pressed their advantage to bring in these types of technologies to modernize their ports compared to others. The other part is there's been a reluctance by the longshoremen to embrace these improvements as well. That's, for me, that's what it comes down to.
How about the follow up on that? How about the ownership of the ports? Who actually owns the majority of the ports throughout the United States?
So the ports, the land itself, oftentimes is owned by local governments, right? So but the operations, the loading and the unloading is done by terminals. A lot of these terminals are owned by the ocean carriers, like the Maersk and the Mediterranean shipping companies of the world. There are independent terminals. Ports America is a good example. They don't have any shipping infrastructure. They don't own any ships or anything like that, but they run the operations at many terminals, not just here in the US, but in Canada and Mexico as well. So it's oftentimes, so there's a complicated relationship oftentimes between the local governments who own the land and the terminals who are responsible for letting the trucks in and getting the containers and all that.
Has that led to the inefficiencies?
So I'm laughing because it depends who you ask, right? So I think if you go and talk to one of my terminal operator members, they're going to say, you know what, like it's been a challenging environment and we've done everything that we can and we're actually doing great. But if you talk to a retailer, they're going to point the finger squarely at the carriers and the terminals and say, you know what, like I can't get my containers from these folks. Like I've got containers have been sitting on dock for 3 months. And I'm getting charged an arm and a leg in storage fees. And it's all because, this terminal operator can't locate my container, or it's buried under, 5 other containers that's like 6 rows back. So it really, I think bottom line, this crisis has exposed that there was a lot of cracks in our system. They had been there for quite some time. And this event has, I think, demonstrated to the US consumer and a lot of businesses that like it was a rickety system to begin with before we got here. And all this is doing is just showing how much work needs to be done across the entire system for it to work better. I think getting back to your first question on the infrastructure side and the infrastructure investment, absolutely. Like it's frankly a embarrassment how difficult it's been for Congress and other policymakers to make the sorts of investments in our infrastructure that a lot of other economies across the world have been doing historically with no problems for quite some time. You look at our investment levels, can you compare it to China? China's kicking our butt. and bottom line, like we've kind of lost the focus, and we're paying for it now.
Thank
John,
you.
are any of the funds from the infrastructure bill, the infrastructure plan that was passed last year, available to upgrade our port and terminal infrastructure?
Yes. In fact, there is, we believe on Thursday or Friday of this week, the Department of Transportation is going to issue a notice of funding availability for the first tranche of what is approximately $17 billion in capital improvement funding dollars for port infrastructure. So we're really happy to see this. I think it was a really good accomplishment by Congress and others to include this money. And we're going to be, and I think people should frankly be paying attention to that money coming out to make sure that policymakers at the state level identify and advance the right projects for funding.
We have a question from TJ Rogers. His question is, what type of impact do you see the current Russian conflict having on our supply chain?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. It's only going to add further disruptions, further uncertainty. I think look, there has been a lot of attention by policymakers on the appropriateness of Russia to be a source of production for U.S. goods, whether it's goods that are purchased by the U.S. government or goods that U.S. consumers can own. And I think what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine is only, I think, fueling policymakers who want to essentially shut off the ability for American consumers and governments to access those goods. So I think it only adds to the uncertainty, and I think it only adds to the attention that policymakers are going to have on Russia and what Russia's producing for the world economy.
One specific question back to the movement of goods. One of the things we are doing in Virginia is establishing the Virginia Infrastructure Academy, which has 4 channels of education through our Virginia Community College system, which includes CDL driver training. Are you seeing that major support for the expansion of increasing our pool of CDL drivers in other parts of the country or on a federal level?
Say that question again. I'm not sure if I followed it. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Just in terms of increasing the pool of CDL drivers to move goods where we need them.
So look, you know, right, and your members know how difficult it is to not just secure enough drivers, but also kind of keep those drivers as well, right? And it's, this is a tough job, and I think, and it's made more difficult, but I think the last couple of years, because a lot of the truck driving pool was historic. It was an older labor pool, right? It was actually, it's several years older than the average American worker is. I think 2-3 years ago, the average age of a truck driver was 48, 49 years old. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these drivers, with COVID, when they either lost their jobs or they kind of saw the opportunities, I think many of them who could retire chose to retire. But it's always been difficult to bring these drivers. It's always been difficult to replace these drivers, especially with you take into account the lifestyle. You can't become a driver or an interstate driver until you're 21 years of age. And that acts as a barrier, because a lot of folks who would take this type of job are also eligible to be construction workers or do other types of work. So by the time they hit 21, 22, for them, being a truck driver just isn't really a realistic option for them, or it may not be a viable option for them. So I think there's been a few opportunities with the infrastructure law, this pilot, to evaluate the safety of allowing 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds to drive. I think it's a valuable study. It's going to be incredibly difficult to raise the driver age. It's going to be incredibly difficult to lower the driving age, rather. So I think we just have to continue kind of leaning in on this. I think these schools are very helpful, especially for making the case for the safety of these younger drivers. But I think, quite frankly, from my vantage point, we need to be having a larger conversation around what a truck driver is. Is it a full-time job? Is it a job that's part of a larger, is it one responsibility, part of a larger job? All these things I think can be really important, because you also, on the other side of this, you've got automation, and there's a lot of attention around driverless trucks. So I used to work for the American Trucking Associations, and my CEO at the time, he would, I thought he was going to have an aneurysm anytime that he heard the CEO for a company called Peloton speak, because the CEO would go out and say, like, well, you don't need to worry about your truck driver problems, because within 5 years, I'm going to have these trucks on the roads that aren't going to need truck drivers at all. And for ATA CEO, like, he'd have this aneurysm because his members were already having a hard enough time as it was to attract new drivers. Here, this guy is going out and shooting off and making it even more difficult, because any 18, 19-year-olds, why would they look to take a job that might be obsolete within 10 years' time? So it's all these external pressures I think are really having a material impact on the challenges of recruiting a sufficient driver supply. Did I answer that question directly? Sorry, I kind of gave a few different responses to it, but hopefully that, okay.
Yeah. Finding drivers is a challenge for everyone.
Yeah. Somebody asked me this last week, I think, and like what the solution is. I said, if I knew the solution, I would not be here speaking to you. I would be, enjoying my island in Aruba, because that's the challenge. That's the challenge we have to figure out.
Does anyone else on the call, on the meeting, have any questions for John? I'm not seeing any hands raised, and I'm not seeing any chat messages. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you, John.
Yeah, may I ask a question, if I may?
Yes, absolutely.
So I would look, so I see all this from high level, right? I'd love to hear, I know we've got 7 or 8 minutes left. I'm not trying to, take time away from your membership, but like, what are you all seeing? What's the experience on the ground? I mean, are you concerned about supply of your goods? Are you, what are the price increases you're seeing? What are the primary challenges that you're facing right now?
Glenn, why don't you take the lead on that?
Oh, wow. You're going to get the smallest guy in the room. John, real quick, labor for CDLs, 30%, 18 months. I'm getting hammered. I'm a smaller contractor. We run between 30 and 50, depending on what our contract load is. I've got 7 trucks for CDL drivers. I've got 5 drivers. When summer kicks up, I'll have 3, because everybody else will come in and steal them for $1, $2. But the threshold, the upper range of that is becoming so high. And the pressure points from our clients, they're crying about inflation as well. So we're stuck in the middle. And compounding that is the price of fuel.
Yeah.
These trucks burn a lot of fuel. I can easily, being a small employer, I lost a couple people right at the beginning of the COVID. I've not replaced them. With the change of the administration, change of policy, I chose not to replace them. That's the fuel differential that we paid in the last 18 months. So, I met with a member firm yesterday. They have supply issues for their equipment. Last year, they got a big delivery. It came all at once, sold it out, and now it's just kind of trickling in. So, people they're getting in batches, like you alluded to. Parts, I've got 2 rollers where I can't find parts. If we could 3D print them, great, but you can't.
Yeah.
And I would pay 10 times, 20 times the cost of that part. Instead, now I'm looking at upgrading the rollers to new rollers. They're saying I can get a new roller, but I can't get a part for the rollers that I've got paid off sitting in my inventory. So you got to put that in the business model. That's how it's affecting our firm. It's across the board in every direction coming at us. It's like you're running a business and then you're running another business within it, just trying to make the model work. It's ever changing. So it's real. It's real dollars right at us.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm sure, I didn't answer this question, the aspect, but Ukraine, right? That's only going to shoot the cost of gasoline through the roof for you, right? As that supply is potentially constricted. So just adding to a challenge that you're already confronting as best you can.
oh yeah, and then our policies changed immediately after, with all the executive orders. That changed the dynamic of our fossil fuels, if you will, or petroleum, immediately. No different than what it did when it preceded the recession, the previous recession that we had. It did the same thing. The fuel costs led into that recession. And those costs they're borne across our whole community. Everything our economy is fuel, petroleum. It's all petroleum based. It's in everything we touch. The difference is now with COVID, we've got the labor issues combined with the fuel issues. That's in a business like all of ours. That's just putting fuel on the fire.
Do on the truck driver, like, is what I'm saying, does that resonate with you? Is that, you think that's at a step with where you're coming from on this? I don't see what the solution is. Like,
I think that I'm fortunate. I think we're fortunate in this area in a sense of the truck drivers we hire. They get up, they come to our facility, if you will, get in the truck, run for the day locally, and they come home. I think that's a big advantage.
Yeah.
You have a lifestyle around that. So that's a different dynamic than an over the road hauler, but they've changed that dynamic. That the trucking companies have now made it more so like that. They're trying to bring that lifestyle, if you will, factor into their hauling routes. And I know that's changing, but I don't know how. I just complained about the labor rate. Well, they should be paid a lot more. Are they not bringing everything? Are they not transferring the goods across this country to us? And it is a difficult job. But the problem with it is the upper range of what we can charge has not adjusted yet. And we're caught in the middle of it. I think if we can get the average trucker to make $100 grand, goes a long way to changing that dynamic, but I don't know when that's going to happen, if it's going to happen.
So you're not seeing the challenges for the day haulers as much because they're home at night, they can go home to their family, not a problem. But certainly you're getting pinched, and pay is going to continue to be an issue. But your customers in some ways you're just waiting, I think, for the prices to fluctuate so that you can better take advantage of any potential opportunities to increase the pay for your drivers. Is that fair?
We have to. Somehow we have to adjust the pricing. I can't speak too openly about it because of the competitive issues of our format. So, but things will have to change. But I think it's an advantage where you can go locally. I think that's an advantage regarding to the micro picture versus the macro picture of finding a truck driver. I think we can benefit from that lifestyle, which helps us a little bit.
Thank you.
Jim Tracy, I noticed you turned your video on. Do you have something to add to that? You're muted, by the way.
Thank you so much. All right. Yeah, John, I was just going to answer your question. We're pinched on both sides. We get it on both sides. First, on the manufacturing of utility products, pipe and stuff, our lead times has crept out. What used to be 2 to 3 weeks are now 5, 6, and up to 9 months. So as soon as you get a job, if I order water pipe today, they're telling me December, and that's hard to forecast and do. So everybody's panic buying, everybody's ordering, even if they don't have the job yet. That's creating problem number one, obviously, which has put these huge backlogs on the production facilities for storm pipe, precast, water pipe, and PVC pipe as well. And you throw fuel, whenever fuel goes up, the PVC skyrockets as well. And then once you finally do get your order made, they got to get a truck on ready, like you said, and that's an issue too. So the challenge we're getting on both sides. The thing that's really challenging is trying to figure out how you can supply a job that, you know, they expect you to start in 2 weeks to a month as soon as you have a permit, but you're getting lead times out 6-8 months. So that's been the challenge for us. And it's not, we thought it'd be a short-term blip, obviously, and it just keeps dragging on. It's not getting any better. In fact, it's getting a skosh worse, I think. And I would also ask a question. The cement production in North America seems to be at capacity. Do you know of any new or any programs or any new manufacturing facilities? Because I know the EPA is so tough on that kind of stuff, that they're in the pipeline to alleviate that.
I don't, but that's only because it's not an area that I track closely. But I could look. Let me see if I can do a little digging and see if I'll look back and with what I learned. Deborah, I'll just loop back with you.
Sure, that would be great. Does
Thank you.
anyone else have any personal experience to share with John about what they're seeing in the workplace, what they're seeing in their project pipeline?
Hi, this is Ivan. Just to give you, John, a perspective where we are the contractor of the I-66 project. It's a $2.4 billion project, and we are being hammered everywhere. We cannot get I-beams on time. We cannot get our gantries. Pipe is an issue, and everything is, you know, the summary of this, what you said. I mean, this drivers, issues with drivers, issue with the raw material, and issue with labor in the manufacturing place. So yeah, we see it. We are working very hard to drive this project to the end and finish on time, but this is keeping us, you know, the nights longer.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I hear this over and over again. You know, God, who was I speaking to last week? Anyways, the point being, like, every industry feels like you hear the same story for them. You know, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you make, the story is the same. Like, they're struggling to get product, they're struggling to get labor, they're struggling to, you know, contend with the fluctuating energy costs that, you know, their supply chains or their logistics operations are facing them with. I mean, just it's tough.
And you know, the interesting, the problems we see today in this year or the end of last year was worse than the problem we saw 2 years ago when the pandemic started.
You say it's worse last year than it was 2 years ago?
Yeah, last year and this year,
Yeah. And, you know, I think, you know, my sense is that there's just going to be increasing, increasing disruption on the supply lines for a lot of businesses that'll be, you know, only accelerating this year going forward. So this sort of, you know, this uncertainty I think a lot of you are facing, you know, I don't think, my sense is it doesn't go away. You know, it's not like there's a return to normal where, like, we just kind of go back to what it was. I think, you know, it's everything has been disrupted, and now people are like putting it all, they're rebuilding the model to you know, to respond to what we've just gone through. And it's, you know, so that just means that there's only going to be further disruption in the months ahead that will only add to the challenges that you're all facing. How's that for a rosy picture?
yeah.
John, Garrett here. So I just to add to that, I'm actually a little fearful as the infrastructure money comes out that we won't have, it'll double or even triple the pressure. We simply don't have the material and or people to build the work that we have under contract now. And as the money pours in from the federal government, and we need to upgrade our infrastructure, but as that money pours in, it's going to be even tighter and be harder to get people and material.
I agree. Thank you.
And this is something that we've talked with the legislators, both on a state level and a federal level, even before the infrastructure bill was passed. And that is, even with millions and billions of dollars funding new infrastructure projects, we simply don't have the people, we simply don't have the materials to actually complete the project or even start the project.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are the solutions you're advocating for right now on that end?
We're working on what we can. As I said, on a state level, we're working with the Virginia community colleges to implement trades education, trades training, to get folks into the construction industry pipeline to actually work. And that's where our efforts can make a difference. Unfortunately, our efforts don't make much of a difference or can't make much of a difference on the materials pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your willingness to share with me your experiences.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, John, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge and giving us insight into where we've come from and potentially where we're going in terms of supply chain expectations. I look forward to circling back with you on a couple of the items that you have accepted, and I certainly will channel to you any feedback and input from our membership, both those who are here today and those who couldn't make it.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for sharing your experiences as well. I've enjoyed the discussion, so thank you again. I've learned a lot. Have a good morning, everybody.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
John.
morning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Glenn.